Committee on Finance, and pursuant to the order of reference on Tuesday, May 2nd, 2023, and the motion adopted on May 16th, 2023, committee's meeting to discuss Bill C-47, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 28th, 2023. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23rd, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and the members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Now, I would like to welcome our witnesses. And just before I welcome the witnesses, we want to thank the witnesses for, graciously accepting our invitation. And I know with very short notice that you had to be with us today and get your opening remarks ready, and also to be able to take all the questions from the members. And that is on behalf of all the committee. So thank you very much. And with us today, we do have Beer Canada. We have the Vice President of Federal Affairs, who's Luke Chapman. We've also have the Canadian Bankers Association with Vice President, Personal and Commercial Banking, Darren Hanna, and the General Counsel and Vice President of Legal and Risk, Angelina Mason. From the Canadian Canola Growers Association, President and CEO Rick White, and Vice President of Government and Industry Relations, Dave Carey. From the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Senior Director of Fiscal and Financial Services Policy, Alex Gray, is with us. From Digital Asset Mining Coalition, a law partner with Fasken, Daniel Brock. And also with Daniel, we have partner from EY Law, David Robertson. And from the Hotel Association of Canada, we have Susie Grinnell is with us, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer. So welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here. We're going to start off by hearing for opening remarks from Beer Canada. So, Mr. Chapman, please.
All right, great. Mr. Chair, honorable members, thank you for the invitation to appear this morning as part of the committee's study of the subject matter of Bill C-47. My name is Luke Chapman. I'm the Vice President of Federal Affairs for Beer Canada, the only inclusive national trade association for Canadian beer companies. Our membership includes 48 small, medium, and large-sized breweries, which, when combined, account for 90% of all beer produced in our country. Domestic brewers are heavily invested in Canada. Last year, 88% of all beer purchased and consumed here was made here by some of the 20,000 Canadians directly employed by brewing companies. The value chain for brewing, packaging, distributing, and selling beer in Canada is long and interconnected. For a pint of beer to reach your glass, brewers depend on Western Canadian barley farmers, can and bottle manufacturers in Central Canada, and truck drivers and restaurant and retail staff from across the country. When all the steps in the production, distribution, and retail process are considered, the production and sale of beer in Canada supports 149,000 jobs, generates over $13 billion in economic activity, and $5.7 billion in taxes. Currently, federal and provincial taxes and markups account for almost half the retail price of beer, giving Canada the title of having the highest beer taxes among G7 countries. I think we'd all agree beer is a social beverage. Enjoying a beer with family or friends at a backyard barbecue, a sports event, an outdoor summer concert, or at a neighborhood pub provides great social and community benefit. In a typical pre-COVID year, restaurants, bars, concerts, sporting events, and other public venues accounted for nearly a quarter of all beer sold in Canada. It's not surprising then that the restrictions placed on social gatherings over the past few years due to the COVID pandemic had a dramatic impact on the Canadian beer market, with total volume beer sales declining by 6% over the past 3 years. Draft beer sales, which primarily occur at restaurants and bars, are still 25% below where they were pre-pandemic in 2019. As brewers were grappling with where and how they were allowed to sell their beer during the pandemic, inflation began to take hold. which presented a new set of difficulties and challenges. For brewers, the concerns were twofold. First, in 2021 and into 2022, the cost of producing, packaging, and distributing beer started to rise rapidly, with key inputs like barley and packaging materials up by as much as 60%. Second, the impact of rising inflation on the annual and automatic federal beer excise duty rate increases, which are determined using a formula that is tied to inflation, was also a concern that was front and center. Since the automatic indexing of federal beer excise duties was included in the 2017 federal budget, beer taxes have increased every year. While we continue to be concerned over this automatic approach to beer taxation and its negative impacts on the Canadian beer and hospitality sectors, we do recognize that CPI inflation was relatively stable for most of the period between 2017 to 2022. And as a result, the annual increases amounted to an average of around 2% over that period. With the past automatic increases were not inconsequential. As we monitored CPI inflation throughout 2022, we reached the conclusion that this year's increase was likely to exceed 6%, making it the largest federal tax increase on beer in the last 4 decades. As a result of the effort and support of MPs from across parties, some of whom are in this room today, so thank you, we were pleased to see the government address our immediate concern by including in the 2023 budget a 2% cap on the 6.3% excise duty rate increase that would have otherwise gone into effect this past April 1st. While this temporary one-year cap was not all our coalition of barley farmers, unionized brewery workers, restaurateurs, consumers, and breweries had been advocating for, and while our position remains that the continued use of automatic excise increases is neither appropriate or effective, particularly in an era defined by high inflation and declining beer sales, we do view a temporary 2% cap as a fair compromise. We certainly welcome and appreciate it that it was included in the 2023 budget. In this respect, and in conclusion, we encourage adoption of Section 124 of the Budget Implementation Act to reduce the scheduled increase in federal beer excise duties from 6.3% to 2% retroactive to April 1st. We thank the members of the Finance Committee for the opportunity to provide our perspective, which we hope will be helpful as they review and consider Bill C-47. Happy to answer any questions after the other witnesses. Thank you.
And now we'll hear from the Canadian Bankers Association, please.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to speak at the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance on Bill C-47, the Budget Implementation Act. My name is Darren Hanna. I'm the Vice President of Personal and Commercial Banking at the Canadian Bankers Association. I'm joined by my colleague Angelina Mason, General Counsel and Vice President, Legal and Risk. The CBA is the voice of more than 60 domestic and foreign banks that help drive Canada's economic growth and prosperity. The CBA advocates for public policies that contribute to a sound, thriving banking system to ensure Canadians can succeed in their financial goals. While Bill C-47 is extensive and the committee is studying numerous provisions, our remarks will be focused on Part 2, Clauses 114 to 116, which retroactively amend the Excise Tax Act. This is a very small component of the Budget Implementation Act, but it has profound implications on how businesses, entrepreneurs, and investors, both domestic and international, view the opportunities and risks of doing business in Canada. Simply put, the government is attempting to legislatively override a decision by the Federal Court of Appeal and retroactively change the GST treatment of payment card clearing services literally back to the introduction of GST in 1991 by expressly overriding the general legislative limitation periods under Section 298 of the Excise Tax Act. The effect is therefore to retroactively tax transactions that happened as long as 30 years ago. In doing so, the government is ignoring widely accepted positions among taxpayers and tax professionals, as well as their own published guidelines for the appropriate and exceptional use of retroactive legislation. The government's position is inconsistent with its own treatment of payment card network services as financial services for the purposes of regulatory oversight by the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. Moreover, through this proposed measure, the government is adding this tax burden at the very time the government is claiming to lower the cost of card acceptance fees for small businesses. Increasing taxes on card issuers and acquirers will inevitably impact the cost of card acceptance for merchants. Retroactively taxing past transactions, especially in the face of court rulings to the contrary, erodes investor confidence in Canada, period. This is a concerning signal to investors, entrepreneurs, and business owners. Core to the decision-making criteria of where to invest is certainty and predictability, not only in the rule of law and in its application, but also in the ability to ensure that I, as an investor, can access the legal system to get fair treatment if I feel that the law is being applied incorrectly. Indeed, this proposed measure fundamentally challenges the traditional understanding of tax law. This approach not only raises serious questions about fairness and legal certainty, but potentially inhibits future economic growth and economic activity. Imposing such a retroactive burden undermines the trust in the certainty of the tax system. While it might seem like an easy fiscal fix for fiscal shortfalls, it's important to consider the long-term implications of such a precedent-setting move. The retroactive tax measures in Part 2 contradict these principles, and in doing so undermine investor confidence in Canada at the very time we need to be attracting new investment both from at home and from abroad. A recent study by RBC indicated that Canada will need an estimated $2 trillion over the next 30 years to finance the transition to a low-carbon economy. These are large, long-term investments that Canada is seeking from investors to pivot our economy to a low-carbon future. An investor will only make that type of commitment if they are certain that the terms, conditions, and business environment upon which they made their investment decision are respected, that the government will not suddenly seek to retroactively revisit those conditions, and that they have recourse to the legal system should they need it. That's why we strongly encourage MPs to take action to restore investor trust in the Canadian economic and legal environment by removing the retroactive provisions of Part 2. I thank the committee for your invitation and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hanna. And now we'll hear from the Canadian Canola Growers Association.
Well, thank you for the invitation to appear here today. My name is Rick White, and I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Canola Growers Association, or CCGA. I'm joined today by Dave Carey, our vice president of government and industry relations. CCGA represents Canada's 43,000 canola farmers on issues that impact their farm success, and it is led by a farmer board of directors with representation from provincial grower associations from Ontario west to BC. CCJ is also the largest administrator of the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Advance Payments Program. Canola is Canada's largest agricultural commodity, earning farmers $13.7 billion in farm cash receipts in 2022. Canada exports 90% of the canola we grow to approximately 50 countries as seed, oil, or meal. Exports were valued at $14.4 billion in 2022, and Canada is the world's largest exporter of canola. International trade underpins the canola sector's $29.9 billion annual economic contribution that supports 207,000 Canadian jobs. Rail is the only practical means of transportation to move canola from the areas of production to port. Canola, on average, travels 1,520 kilometers by rail from farm to tidewater to be in export position. Transportation of grain is one of several commercial elements that directly affects the price offered to farmers. When issues arise in the supply chain, the price farmers receive for their grain can drop, even at times when commodity prices may be high in the global marketplace. Additionally, recent announcements over the last 2 years in the prairies of 5 new canola processing facilities or expanded capacity of existing facilities signal that demand for canola is on the rise. These private investments of over $2 billion will increase Canadian processing capacity by over 50% over what it was in 2020. Increased rail capacity will be required to move more product, and the reliability and timeliness of rail service will be critical for Canada's farmers to meet this demand. At full build-out, this increase in domestic processing will likely create a shift in dominant trade flows of canola products, with less raw seed being destined for the West Coast for export and more canola oil being transported domestically, especially to supply the expanding renewable fuel sector in North America. As such, we are very pleased to see the budget recognize the need to incentivize competition in our Class 1 railways by proposing a pilot trial to increase the extended interswitching limits in the prairies. If done correctly, this pilot will promote fair competition, it will reduce transportation costs, and it will enable Canada's reputation as a reliable supplier of canola. To further strengthen this policy, this committee should seriously consider the following points, 3 of them. Number 1, set the extended interswitching distance to 500 kilometers to ensure competitive market forces are available to all grain elevators and major agriculture producing regions. Under the 160-kilometer radius proposed, there are significant regional geographies in the 3 prairie provinces that remain outside of the pilot, producing an uneven playing field based on physical location. Number 2, ensure that extended interswitching is available to all North American.
S'assurer que cela est disponible pour intégrer.
To integrate the
Mr.
North
Mr.
American
White, sorry, I was
market.
just getting, I don't know if other members did receive some, I was hearing another voice come through. Yeah, okay.
Yes, I heard it.
Okay, so we did pause the time. Apologize for the interruption. Okay.
No
Go ahead,
worries.
Mr. White.
Okay, and so number 2, to ensure extended interswitching is available to all North American railways to further integrate the North American market and shorten the distance goods need to travel. And number 3, ensure the pilot lasts a minimum of 5 years to unlock the full potential of competition. The functional use of an 18-month extended interswitching pilot may be limited due to the fact that many shippers have previously negotiated service contracts with the railways. For my last closing comment, although it is not in the BIA specifically, we were also pleased to see the announcement on the funding of $85 million for the Canada Water Agency, and that it will be located in Winnipeg. We believe the CWA can support existing provincial and new national water monitoring work, incentivize natural water management, infrastructure, and build on proven approaches to stakeholder engagement. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. White. And now we're going to hear from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce.
Budget 2023 presented the government with an opportunity to enable and sustain the conditions necessary to grow our economy and raise future generations' standard of living. Some elements are laudable. Taken as a whole, however, we see Budget 2023's lack of a decisive strategy to attract the investment required for a strong, sustainable economic future for Canada as a missed opportunity that would ensure our competitive advantage in perpetuity. Indeed, the disruptions caused by the pandemic continue to reverberate through the economy. According to Statistics Canada, Canadian real GDP in the fourth quarter of 2022 was 6.5% less than the pre-COVID trend would have predicted. That is more than $180 billion per year in lost output. If that lost output were its own industry, it would be Canada's third largest contributor to GDP, behind real estate and manufacturing. Additionally, our international competitors continue to outpace us as Canada experiences low growth and weak labor productivity. It was Budget 2022 which first noted that labor productivity growth in Canada has slowed from about 2.7% in the 1960s and 70s to less than 1% today. Correcting this trend requires government to create a strategy that eliminates the disincentives that drive away investment while focusing on pro-business policies for the benefit of all Canadians. However, strategy without execution is pointless, and there are many obstacles for Canadian businesses to overcome. We cannot hope to attract private sector investment without pragmatic, predictable policies. Start with our inadequate trade-enabling infrastructure. The status quo impedes our ability to get goods like critical minerals and agricultural products from where they're produced to the ports of export and beyond. We need several measures, such as twinning rail capacity, increasing industrial lands around airports and ports, and investing in warehousing and bridge capacity. As with much of the Canadian economy, we need to move faster and to evaluate and improve projects. Indeed, the way we regulate major projects is badly broken. Said projects for developing and exporting energy and critical minerals take so long and are burdened with so much unpredictability and uncertainty that they die not from government decisions, but from its inability to make and implement them. Additionally, our convoluted tax code continues to drag on our economic competitiveness. Most recently, the introduction of several sector-specific taxes introduces unwelcome volatility and unpredictability to the Canadian business climate. In BIA 1, we are particularly concerned about the proposition of yet another such tax, the proposal to alter the GST and HST definition of a financial service in the Excise Tax Act to exclude payment card network operator services. First, as with the digital services tax, we oppose the retroactive nature of this proposal, which would allow the CRA to assess taxpayers as far back as 1991. Canadian businesses cannot plan and invest for the future with the ever-looming possibility of retroactive taxation. Additionally, this new tax will decrease Canadian competitiveness while increasing the costs of doing business in Canada. In general, other jurisdictions exempt their payment card network operators from similar taxes. In defining this best practice, the government would be placing Canada's financial services sector at a competitive disadvantage relative to its international peers. Further, increasing the cost of card acceptance would force businesses to weigh shouldering a new fee or passing it along to consumers, a difficult proposition as the cost of living remains high for many. Finally, with over 800,000 job vacancies in Canada, we had also hoped to see the budget focus more sharply on the skills and talent our workforce will need now and into the future. Measures such as enhancing the Express Entry program, improving interprovincial and foreign credential recognition practices, and reducing seniors' disincentives to work would cost little while helping businesses address a core challenge. If these exhortations for progress on regulation, taxation, and skills sound familiar, it is perhaps because they were singled out as impediments to growth in the Advisory Council on Economic Growth's final report in 2017. We had hoped to see more progress between then and now. It is regrettable that Budget 2023 did not contain several of these low or no-cost growth measures, yet Canadian business remains eager to partner with government to create a strategy that will meet the moment. Given the headwinds we faced, that is needed more than ever. Thank you.
Ray, and now we'll move to the Digital Asset Mining Coalition, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to committee members for having us here to speak with you today. My name is Daniel Brock. I'm a partner at the Canadian law firm Fasken. I'm joined by David Robertson from EY Law. Together, we are advising an industry coalition representing more than 23 companies and organizations all participating in Canada's growing digital asset and blockchain ecosystem. The coalition came together last spring to address a surprise legislative proposal published by the Department of Finance in February of 2022 that would increase our members' costs of carrying on business in Canada by 5 to 15%. It is about this proposal, as it appears in Bill C-47, that we are here to speak with you today. In 2017, Canadians might have been using their computers in their basement or garage to mine for Bitcoin. Today, almost all digital asset mining is big business. Companies are using industrial-scale computing to verify and secure transactions that occur on a public blockchain. At today's market rate, the transaction fees and subsidies for adding a single block to the Bitcoin network has a value of almost $200,000. More than 1,000 blocks get added to the Bitcoin blockchain every week. That's more than $200 million in potential revenue per week for mining pool companies that mine for Bitcoin. There are, however, no major mining pool companies in Canada. All are non-residents to Canada, based primarily in the USA, in Asia, and in Europe. Canada's role in this emerging industry is not in mining for Bitcoin. Instead, Canadians are the suppliers of high-performance computing power that makes Bitcoin mining possible. Canadian companies take advantage of our cooler climate, our skilled workforce, our excess hydroelectric energy to produce and export clean computing power as a commodity like wheat or precious metals. Canadian computing companies are quickly becoming industry leaders in the supply of clean computing power that international blockchain mining pool companies want. Since 2018, this high-performance computing sector has brought in more than $2 billion in revenue to Canada. It has paid millions of dollars in corporate property and payroll taxes. It has invested $1.5 billion in the rural and resource communities in which they operate. And it has created 1,500 well-paying, high-tech jobs in these communities. The average age of employees in most of these companies, under 35 years old. Our main concern with the finance proposal on crypto asset mining is that this early success and the potential for future growth in Canada is being put at risk. There are several problems with the proposed GST changes. Let me highlight three. First, proposed new Section 188 Sub 2 declares that a Canadian company that A, allows its computing resources to be used by foreign non-resident mining pool companies for crypto asset mining, and B, shares in the proceeds of that mining, is not engaged in commercial activity and will not be able to receive input tax credits. By contrast, all other companies that allow their computing resources to be used by non-residents are entitled to inputs tax credits, regardless of how that computing power is used or how their fees are calculated. Second, by denying input tax credits to Canadian computing companies, these new rules make them less competitive in the international marketplace. The GST replaced the old federal sales tax in 1991 specifically to remove Canadian sales taxes as an input cost for Canadian businesses. The GST is to encourage both investment in Canada and Canadian exports, and to make our goods and services more competitive in international markets. Proposed new Section 188 Sub 2 does the exact opposite. Third, the GST proposal creates a competitive disadvantage for computing companies across Canada, depending on the province in which they reside. The GST proposal creates an incentive for companies operating, for example, in Quebec or in Newfoundland, where the embedded sales tax cost will be 15%, to move their operations to Alberta, where the sales tax cost will be only 5%, or outside of Canada altogether. The GST should never lead to this type of competitive imbalance for businesses within Canada. So what's the solution? We think there is a simple solution that is consistent with good GST policy. We are asking this committee to add a clear and unambiguous exception to the GST proposal. This exception should state that if a Canadian company supplies its computing power to a mining pool operator who is a non-resident of Canada, then subsection 1882 does not apply to them, and instead, the ordinary GST rules will apply. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brock. And now that we're experiencing better weather, and I'll keep my fingers crossed on that, we're going to hear from the Hotel Association of Canada, and Ms. Grinnell, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci pour l'invitation.
Thank you for inviting me today.
And CEO of the Hotel Association of Canada. 3 years ago, tourism was in a total lockdown. Our industry was devastated. We lost 1 million workers in the first 2 months of COVID. Since reopening, our sector has experienced a dramatic leisure demand renaissance. Domestic spending has already surpassed 2019 levels. U.S. bookings are up 111%. Europe and Asian search patterns are up 132% and 114% respectively, while business travel and major events continue to lag pre-pandemic levels. The problem is that we can't service the demand we have today or our future growth. We simply can't keep up, and we are turning guests away every day. And that's because when you shut down an entire sector for 2 years and it loses its most precious asset, its people, it becomes very difficult to reopen and operate effectively. This summer, our industry will be short a staggering 360,000 workers. That's exponentially higher than any other sector. Today, in our off-season, 47% of Canadian hotels are pulling rooms off the market because they don't have the staff needed to maintain service standards. This has real impact. A 100-room hotel in one of your ridings that's just short 9 employees stands to lose over $700,000 a year. They can't reinvest into their organization or recover the losses that they experienced during COVID. As a result of COVID shutdowns, Canada also lost major international events, fell behind in creating new hotel capacity, and dropped from 5th to 13th in our global competitiveness ranking. Top competitors like France, Australia, and Spain are aggressively investing in the billions to capitalize on the global travel market, which is at an all-time high. So what can Canada do to address our reopening challenges and maximize our growth potential? Mr. Chair, we have 3 recommendations. The first is labor, the second is investment, and the third is a coordinated government approach. On labor, we are doing everything possible to attract and re-attract workers and repair the damage done through COVID layoffs when travel was shut down. Our members have increased pay, enhanced benefits, adopted new flexible ways of working, but these efforts won't be enough. Our growth will need to come from immigration. And so, our number one ask of government is that our in-demand positions be prioritized for processing in both our temporary and permanent immigration streams, including consideration for seasonal peak periods. In addition, we should be better supporting new Canadians to find work in high-growth sectors like tourism and hospitality. Our association has run a bridge program with the federal government doing exactly this for Syrian refugees before the pandemic. It was a significant success, according to the government's own report, and it could be resurrected with little effort and minimal funding to support the many Ukrainians that have arrived in Canada since the war. This program should be invested in immediately to support our critical labor shortage. Our second recommendation is investment in tourism products and experiences. In this year's budget, we were delighted to see the investments of $108 million for local tourism projects and $50 million to attract high-value business events. But we can and must go further. The government has an opportunity to co-invest in new tourism attraction and experiences so that we can capitalize on the strong international interest in Canada. We need to keep marketing our Canadian brand to the world, and we need to ensure that we have enough experiences and hotel capacity to support this growth. Finally, we are eagerly awaiting the announcement of the government's tourism growth strategy, where we assume rebuilding our workforce will be a central element, as it was not included in the federal budget. But this strategy also has to include a coordinating body that would bring together multiple government departments to address our critical issues, like labor. This should be led by the Minister of Tourism, including IRCC, ESDC, International Trade, Finance, and Treasury Board. This ask doesn't cost any money, but it is essential that we get the right representatives around the table with a mandate to help us solve our deepest COVID-related challenges. Tourism is Canada's largest service export. We employ Canadians in every region and riding across this country. We proved through COVID that we are resilient, and given the opportunity, we can lead a remarkable recovery. Members of the committee, the opportunity before us is historic, but the potential will not last forever. We need to act boldly and quickly to secure the next 10 years for Canadians and for our tourism industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Grinnell, and thank you to all the witnesses for your opening remarks. We've got approximately 90 minutes for members to ask questions, and we'll start right away. In our first round, we've got the Conservatives up for 6 minutes, and I have MP Baldinelli. Welcome to our committee, MP Baldinelli.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being with us today. And I'd like to begin with Ms. Grinnell, and thank you, if I may, Susie, for all the work and advocacy that you've done, not only for the Hotel Association, but for the Tourism Industry Association and for the Coalition of Hardest Hit. I think you're being a little shy, too, and not recognizing the fact that you're representing over 8,000 facilities and 460,000 employees in Niagara Falls alone. I've got 16,000 hotel rooms and 40,000 people come to depend on tourism for their livelihoods. And you mentioned some of the distressing kind of signs. I mean, it's been 3 years. I mean, that we've essentially lost our tourism years. 2 years because of COVID. I put the entire blame on last year on a useless ArriveCan app that did nothing but keep people away from this destination. But let's talk about the labor situation, because that is something that is impacting our community, my community. primarily. I mean, we've got huge backlogs on the full-time stream, as well as issues with regards to temporary foreign workers. I want you to explain a little bit more about the issues. I mean, in Niagara Falls, I had hoteliers that were not renting out floors of rooms because they had no people to work to clean those rooms. Can you provide more of a description of what we're going through?
I think the statistic that should stun the committee is that 47% of Canadian hotels today in our off-season are pulling inventory out of the market. That's in our off-season, and that's because we can't service that demand. I mean, what a missed opportunity. And when we think about global travel demand is at an all-time high. If you just look at Google as a major indicator, travel to Canada is up 100% from 2019. People want to come to Canada, but they won't be able to find a hotel room, and they'll be dealing with all sorts of tourism businesses that will be closed over this time period. And our competitors are eating our lunch. They are investing in the billions. And they have also resolved the labor challenges. And I think there are some really good examples that we should look to, like the temporary foreign worker program, which in Canada today requires businesses to guarantee 30 hours a week. And that's for 18 months. Well, what happens in the off season? So now you have a temporary foreign worker that you require 30 hours. You're in the off season. Are you going to lay off Canadians, or are you going to keep those temporary workers? So we're not maximizing that program. But other countries have figured out how to do this. There is a temporary tourism visa that allows workers to come in, service the season, but then also re-enter in other seasons without having to go through another round of paperwork.
And you've probably heard this from several of your owners and operators, but I mean, even the issue of bringing workers here, but then there's no place to house them. In Niagara Falls, we've already have one of the lowest rental accommodation and housing accommodation rates anywhere in this country. Yeah. So where do these new workers live? And so there's a housing crisis as well that needs to be addressed. And quite frankly, this government's national housing strategy has failed. And so we're still looking for units so that we can even, bring these individuals and those residents that live in our community so that they can work in these facilities. Like you said, we're leaving money on the table. And so how do we address that?
So housing is a major concern for sure. I would look to the committee and their leadership and across government to continue to work on that issue. I can tell you our industry is getting creative about how we solve that and building additional staff accommodations, but that gets really hard in downtown Toronto and in downtown Vancouver, so there needs to be more creative solutions there for sure. But I think going back a step to just get the workers in Canada in the first place is a major consideration for our sector.
And one of the issues, too, that you touched upon, I mean, as we're trying to recover, I mean, those last 3 years, a lot of these facilities, they leveraged themselves quite tremendously. And for 3 years, they haven't had an opportunity to actually, raise or generate the revenues needed to pay off those rents. During the discussions on how this $108 million will be spent over 3 years. Have you been able to work with government officials to kind of tailor the criteria for these new programs that are going to be distributed through the 7 regional development agencies so that the issues, like the issues that we had previously with HASCAP and so on, can be addressed in some of the funding criteria that's going to be established?
I think it's too soon for that still. Certainly we're engaged with government on the rollout there, but we're not sure how that money is going to roll out. But it is for regional development. I think the issue you're referring to is on the debt side, which is still a major consideration for sure. The fact that we are leaving money on the table every day and not generating revenue to cover the crippling debt that our industry has had to incur over the COVID period is just heartbreaking. And the suggestion that we have here doesn't actually cost the government anything. It's nonsensical that we've not updated our immigration laws to both temporarily and permanently to support growth. And I'll tell you the greatest opportunity in front of us is a bridge program that could help new Canadians that have arrived into Canada. We've run a program like this before for Syrian refugees. And what it does is it enhances their experience when they land, supports the settlement agencies, it brings the employers to the table. We're just a little more prescriptive about where people are going to land. And we believe they should be in high growth sectors like ours we could be doing a much better job of supporting those new Canadians and getting them into available jobs and closing that path from arrival to gainfully employed.
And in communities like Niagara Falls.
And now over to the Liberals, MP Baker, please, for 6 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here. I wish I'd had time to ask questions of all of you. I won't be able to do that, and I hope you all understand that. I'd like to start with the folks from the Canadian Bankers Association. So just for your context, I mean, I used to be a banker. That was my first job coming out of university, and I used to be a management consultant, and I consulted a lot in the payment space. I'm very familiar with this, and so I come at this from that perspective. And I guess the first thing I want to ask you is that, just to clarify, so the issue you have is that the BIA would impose a change that would cause GST or HST to be charged on a service. This is a service that networks charge to card issuers. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, what they are proposing to do is retroactively make a change to tax legislation to override a court case to effectively change the tax treatment of assessment fees that card networks charge to both issuers and acquirers.
Right. So it's tax charged by networks for the folks at home, right? When we talk about a network, we're talking about like Visa or MasterCard charging. This is a service that Visa or MasterCard charges the banks for. And the concern that you have is that there'll now be HST charged on that. That's the concern.
The concern that we have is that the government is retroactively trying to make a change. Our concern is with the retroactive dimension of this,
Right.
that they are trying to retroactively change use legislation to override, in effect, a court case, and in effect override, therefore, the court decision.
Yeah. So I mean, because here's the thing, right? So, like from 1990, would you agree that from 1991 until 2021, which is when the federal court released its decision, that all or almost all banks were charged in paying GST on payment card clearing services? And that's kind of a yes or no question, right?
The answer is it was contested through the entire period.
No, but sorry, I don't have a lot of time, and I just want to make sure we're clear about the facts, right? Like, is the answer yes or no to that question?
The answer is that they contested it through the entire period. There was a charge, and then the institutions would go back to CRA. CRA did nothing, and then eventually they were taken to court and they lost. The
Okay, so you're not answering my question. I'll move on to the next question. Until the Federal Court of Appeal decision in 2021, is it fair to say that only a minority of banks were challenging the tax or filing tax paid in error claims?
For the last 20 years, institutions have been challenging this. They've been going to CRA. CRA has not been responding. The government lost. The government then did nothing, sat on its hands for 2 years, and then all of a sudden we see retroactive legislation.
And let's go back to the impact of this, right? So as a percentage of the interchange fees earned by banks in any given year, could you estimate for us the percentage of those earnings that the GST paid on these payment card clearing services amounts to?
I don't know, and it's not the point. Frankly, the point here is the principle that's at stake. The point is that there is an application of law happening in retrospect. They are changing the tax law. They are overriding a court decision.
So I guess you're not really answering my questions, right? And I guess I'm asking you what the impact will be, because for the folks at home. So let me now finish my question. You know, for my constituents in Etobicoke Centre, what they're concerned about is going to be, look, you know, is this an appropriate measure, and what's the impact of this measure? What are the pros and cons of this? I've heard you on the retroactivity. You've said that multiple times. We've all heard you. But what I'm trying to understand is, what is the monetary impact here, and what is the impact to the banks, to the issuers of this? And so what I'm asking again is, of that share of business of the interchange fees earned by banks, right, which you earn on every transaction that Canadians pay when they use their card or their debit card or whatever the payment mechanism tends to be, of that pool of funds that you make, what amount of money or what percentage of those earnings does this GST on the clearing services represent?
Can't tell you the specific number. I can tell you that ultimately issuers, that cardholders will pay more and that merchants will pay more because the tax affects both issuers and acquirers.
Okay. So banks will make less money. Is that
Sorry?
right? So what you're saying is banks will make less money.
I'm saying that ultimately what will happen here is that cardholders will be affected and the merchants will be affected.
Okay. So as someone who knows a lot about the payment space, I don't agree with that assertion that cardholders will be affected, the consumers will be affected. I think banks could be affected by a very negligible amount. This is a very negligible amount we're talking about. The other thing I would point out is that, you've talked about the retroactivity quite a bit here, and the Tax Court of Canada in 2018 gave a ruling in favor of CRA on this matter. So if we're going to go back to court cases and which court ruled, how the courts ruled, I would note that not all the court rulings have been in your favor. But I think the point I would make, because I'm almost out of time, is simply that I think there are many, and another witness from the chamber raised the fact of competitiveness in the context of this point. And I think we do a lot to make sure that our financial services sector is competitive and our payments, and especially in the payment space, that we're competitive. There are a lot countries regulate their payment spaces very differently around the world. And there are a lot of things that we do to enable that here. And so what I'm hearing is that a relatively negligible amount of money, additional money, will have to be paid by the banks in HST. It conforms with the 2018 court decision, and this change will have no impact on consumers. Yes, we'll ask banks to pay a little bit more in HST, but I do think that we've done a lot of things to help the financial services sector and the payment sector thrive in this country.
That's
Sure.
the
Just
time.
a quick point
MP
of order
Baker.
there.
Yeah, a point of order, MP Lawrence.
Yeah, just a process. I just wanted to make sure that that everyone was clear that I believe that I'm not incorrect in this, that our job here is to ask witnesses questions, not ourselves.
Yeah, MP Lawrence. We're going now to the block. MP Saint-Marie, please.
Chair, a point of order.
Point of order.
Look, I think it is really disappointing that Mr. Lawrence had the nerve to say that in this committee. After we just spent 25
So
hours listening to them
we would ask
speak
for
to
decorum
themselves,
from all the.
speak to themselves and waste this committee's time. And now I didn't ask myself a question. I asked the witness a question. I'd like that
Baker.
to be shown.
Listen, I agree. Listen, decorum and respect. All members know that, and we would hope that would be the case, and we would continue in that theme with throughout this meeting. The block, MP Saint-Marie, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I would like to welcome all of our witnesses today. We have a very interesting panel today. As you can see, we sometimes work very long hours and things can get a little bit heated, but the questions are interesting. My questions will be for Mr. Brock and Mr. Robertson, but first I have a question for Mr. Hanna and Ms. Mason. The financial system in Canada is one of the most stable. I recognize that, and it's great. However, I'm very curious about these Bay Street banks. I'm very critical about them and how they claim their finances. We do need justice, stability, and the fact that there are retroactive laws that are imposed, it kind of feels like a banana republic. And I hope that the committee will be able to take your recommendations into consideration. Now, Mr. Brock and Mr. Robertson, thank you for your opening remarks. There were some very concerning elements. I would just like to say that from the get-go, I'm not a fan of cryptocurrency. I find it to be a very concerning trend. But as I said earlier, I do believe that there should be stability and equity in the fiscal system. What we have in Quebec and in Canada are firms with huge servers, with computing abilities that are very high. They have access to fiber internet as well. There's an ecosystem, and these companies, what they do is sell their computing capacities to other companies. I have a background in that allows me to understand this whole idea. What we see with C47 is that when in this industry, when you sell some of your services to foreign companies that do data mine or that do mining, then we are differentiating you from other companies. So we allow you to deduce your to get tax credits, but we wouldn't allow that for you. The other element that I find concerning is that these businesses bring good jobs, but they already exist in Quebec, and they use clean energies. These, if C47 is voted on and adopted on as such, then companies will have to pay more. In Alberta, it would be 5% more, which is less than what we would pay here. And so that would leave less room for competition in Quebec. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that in order to bring more equity to the industry and the sector.
It is a kind of an interesting aspect of this proposal that it seems to run entirely counter to the government's laudable efforts to combat climate change. Not to take anything away from the businesses that are operating in Alberta, they do great work as well. But in Quebec, the opportunity is very rich for this industry, this high-performance computing industry, to take hold, to create jobs, to attract investment, to bring in revenue into Canada. When this law was first being prepared for Minister Morneau back in 2015-16, this industry didn't exist, not as it does today. And so and it is a rapidly changing industry in which the technology is rapidly changing. And Canada has found itself in a unique position to be able to supply this service globally with clean power. One of the criticisms of the crypto asset or digital asset mining space is its high energy use. There are many industries that use a lot of energy. This is one. When it uses energy from Canada, it's typically clean energy or low carbon energy. When it uses this energy from Russia or Kazakhstan or even the United States, which are the three companies above Canada in supplying energy to this industry, it's fossil fuel generated energy. When this law was prepared, and there was not that understanding of the industry. When the law was tabled in February of 2022, the department, and we work with the department, we have respect for the officials that work in the department. They, like many people, are struggling to understand this industry. That they had not consulted with anybody in this industry that had just been grown up since 2017. The $2 billion that we talk about in revenue generated, that largely came in since 2018. They did not consult with the industry, so they couldn't really understand the impacts of this law on them. So the correction that we're looking for is to take the law that they've created and create a very small clarification to the exception there, to make it clear that Canadian companies that do high-performance computing and sell that high-performance computing as a commodity to the international marketplace, that they be treated like any other computing business, and receive full input tax credits so that they can continue to grow their businesses. David, did you want to add something?
I can take you to exactly the problem in the legislation. If you have Section 118 of BIA available, so that's proposed Section 188, there's a definition of mining activity. Paragraph C says that a mining activity includes allowing computing resources to be used for the purpose of crypto asset mining. So if you think about that, I've got computers, I could be AWS, I have computers, I've got computing servers, but the use of my customer, and in this case my customer outside of Canada, is determining that I'm now being deemed to be engaged in their activity. And then it has a provision, the definition of mining group means a group of persons that share in mining payments. Sharing is not something that's defined, that is used anywhere in the legislation. If a landlord signs a triple net lease and says, I'll rent you this store, but one element is you're going to pay me 2% of your revenue, does that constitute sharing in the revenues of the store? So all we're asking for, the officials from the Department of Finance have suggested that there is an exemption for this sector, but what I'm hearing from the Bankers Association about certainty, we're looking for certainty. What we're asking for is a very simple amendment, just added after, that says, with respect to a mining activity, if a Canadian is performing it for a non-resident mining pool, that we're excluded from the legislation. As simple as that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, MP Sainte-Marie. And now to the NDP and MP Blakey, please.
Thank
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I had a question for Mr. Hanna. I heard loud and clear you don't have the number today in terms of what the cost to banks would be if this legislation were to pass as is. Is that because your members aren't sure what their financial exposure is as a result of these changes to the law, or is it because they haven't shared that information with you?
I mean, I'll start by saying, in some respects, it's both. Look, you have retroactive legislation that really applies potentially all the way back to the introduction of GST. So when I have
Excusez-moi, appel au règlement, la traduction.
I'm sorry, inaudible for the interpreter.
Good? Okay. Okay, we're good to go again. Thank you, MP Samari and MP Blakey. Continue.
Okay. You have retroactive legislation that applies literally back to the inception of GST, if you take it back far enough. When I get calls from clients, and I do from institutions, their first question is, I don't understand my exposure, because I've got something here that has literally no end to it. So they're trying to figure that out for themselves.
I hear that, and I've certainly heard that, you say that the application of tax in this regard has been contested for a long time now. I guess my next question just is, well, in the labor movement, we have an expression, work now, grieve later. So I'm interested to know, have they been paying the tax while they've disputed it? And then, if this weren't to pass, and given the 2021 decision, would they be entitled to a rebate on the taxes they've already paid? Or have they not been paying this tax while it's been contested and then would have to pay going back?
No, they have been paying it. That's exactly the issue. They've been paying it and contesting it for the better part of 20 years. And it was only at the point where they got, frankly, to the point where they took it to court, where CRA finally, where ultimately the government lost, that all of a sudden that this has come about. What happened was, just to be clear, the institutions paid it. They would file a request with CRA for, in effect, tax paid in error. CRA would do nothing. Eventually, CRA denied a claim. That's what precipitated the court case. The facts of the matter were heard. The government lost at the Federal Court of Appeal. The government could have, had they wanted to appeal to the Supreme Court. They chose not to do that, which speaks volumes of how they view the strength of their case. They then basically sat on their hands for 2 years. Finance said nothing. And then all of a sudden, retroactive legislation comes out, which effectively tries to erase 20 years' worth of history.
So then, based on the 2021 decision, if this bill weren't to pass with those provisions in it, the effect would be the government would be required to rebate the taxes that they've been paying over the time that they've been contesting the decision.
Yes, where there have been...
If it passes as it is, then they would no longer be entitled to that rebate. And we can contest whether that's right or wrong based on the principle of retroactive law or not. But effectively, this has the impact of stopping a rebate to banks on money they've already paid to government. Is that a fair assessment of the impact?
Yes, it would make it so that the requests for overpayment that they have made or would make in response to the ruling would then simply no longer be allowed to be processed.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Brock, I'm just curious to know, in respect of the issues that you've raised here today, my understanding, we had heard from officials previously on this, and what they were saying was that the kind of current state of affairs that they're trying to correct, and we can argue the merits of that, obviously we will, and you have to some extent already, is that because it's hard to identify the customer, given the makeup of mining pools and the anonymity that exists in respect of some of those pools and the way they're constructed, it's impossible to assess the GST. So there's no way for government to raise revenue on the GST. And I think their claim is that the input tax credits are designed to offset tax that would be paid. But here, structurally, we have a situation where tax cannot be paid. And so it doesn't make sense to extend the input tax credit. Is that That's what I understood from officials. Is that your understanding as well? So, or do you think there's something else about it the committee ought to know?
I'll let my colleague David go into the tax details,
Okay.
but what the officials came to you speak about is the activity of these mining pool companies and their relationship to the Bitcoin network and the transactions that happen on that network and these Bitcoin companies who verify and secure those transactions. That entire activity that finance is referencing happens outside of Canada. It doesn't happen in Canada. The Canadian businesses that provide the computing support for this industry that make Bitcoin mining possible, they are in Canada. Their clients are outside of Canada. They are creating a service, they're creating a supply of clean, high computing services, which they are selling to a non-resident of Canada. They know exactly who their client is. Their client is the mining pool company. Their client pays them for the services they provide. What this legislation does is it confuses the whole thing. It tries to combine this Canadian activity, which is discrete computing services, with the broader questions about how, from a regulatory point of view, we should treat the Bitcoin network, how we should treat people who transact on that network, what should the regulatory oversight be. These are all perfectly legitimate questions that the government should grapple with. There should be a framework of law and regulation that addresses these issues. But the issue of the GST and these companies is very simple and very clear. They're creating computing services. They're selling those computing services to a non-resident company. Those services should be rated 0 for GST purposes, and they should be able to claim their input tax credits.
And we're over time. So we are members and witnesses. We're moving into our second round. We have MP Morantz is up for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hanna, I wanted to talk to you about this issue of the credit network operating services because, I've seen the government, since I've been here since 2019, break a lot of promises. And if I were to list them all, I would run out of time. But what I've never seen is the government make a promise in a budget and then break that promise in the same budget. So let me read you something from Budget 2023. It says, and I realize that interchange fees are different than the card network operating services tax, but I'm not conflating those. But the government said is that the pandemic brought an increase in people using credit cards when they shop. Small businesses pay fees, with the largest component being the interchange fees. They promised to lower these transaction fees. Budget 23, the government is announcing that it has secured commitments from Visa and MasterCard to lower fees for small businesses while also protecting rewards points for Canadian consumers offered by Canadian large banks. Now, your organization, the Canadian Bar Association, have made submissions. Moneris has made a submission. In Moneris's submission, they say treatment of payment card clearing services and its impacts on not only the Canadians acquiring, we want to draw your attention to a proposed amendment in the Excise Act with respect to goods and services tax, the treatment of payment card clearing services and its impacts on not only the Canadian acquiring the payments industry, but on Canadian merchants and consumers. The proposed change may ultimately result in higher costs to merchants and therefore higher costs to Canadian families at a time when we're working towards making life more affordable. So on one hand, we've got the government saying, hey, we're going to pat ourselves on the back. We made a deal with the credit card companies to lower these interchange fees. And at the same time, they're bringing in retroactive legislation to go back to 1991. Now, let me, at the risk of being accused of what Mr. Baker was being accused of, I'm going to go on. The Canadian Bar Association says in their correspondence, Canadian democracy is founded on the rule of law, and the law should be such that people will be able to be guided by it. It is important for people to be able to foresee the consequences of their conduct in order that persons be given fair notice of what to avoid. It's a basic tenet of our legal system that the legal consequences that flow from a person's conduct should be judged on the basis of the law in force at the time. So, given all of this, I recognize your frustration, and it's more of a comment than a question. But how are merchants supposed to deal with the situation where now CRA can go back 30 years and try and collect money from them that is based on this retroactive rule?
Your point is very well taken, and indeed I mentioned it in the open remarks. It is ironic that the government is proposing this measure at the very time that they're trying to claim to lower the cost of card acceptance fees for small businesses, because you're increasing taxes on issuers, you're increasing taxes on acquirers. Ultimately, it's going to affect the cost of card acceptance for merchants.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, Mr. Gray, your CEO, Mr. Beatty, has made a number of comments about this budget, and mainly it's around productivity, and you alluded to productivity in your opening statement. Budget 2022 acknowledged this problem, as you mentioned, and in fact, the finance minister in her opening statement called this problem Canada's Achilles heel. Now, we have a government that was brought to power in 2015. This is 2023. Canada is dead last in the OECD for productivity. This is a very serious problem and unfortunately, we don't have a government that's serious about solving it. What do you think this government should do to solve it?
I think from our membership, we hear two key areas of concern that lead to lower productivity in the Canadian economy. One is the difficulty of investing such that it will yield a reasonable return. As we noted during our criticism of the stock buyback tax, companies don't buy back their stocks just because they want to. It's because they don't see anywhere else they can reasonably deploy their capital. And I think you could very well describe the same thing in terms of lagging productivity. Productivity is not an issue of Canadians not working hard. It's in large part a product of not having the tools necessary to do the job and to do it as well as could possibly be done. You're, for example, an employer not investing in the technology and software that would enable you to automate certain workflows or streamline certain processes. The other is a function of just we don't have enough labor. There's a labor shortage. This is why we're coming out very strongly in terms of reducing seniors' disincentives to work, streamlining the express entry program, ensuring that all Canadian businesses have the people that they need to invest, thrive, and grow. I believe the best testament was offered by the Hotel Association Canada here. Just the amount of lost revenue at a time when they should be ramping up operations is absolutely stunning.
And now to MP Chatel, please, for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. There's an interesting debate. I can tell you that there's a huge difference between the cases we're seeing in certain countries, not in Canada, with regards to retroactive legislation. Since the introduction of the GST in 1991, it's always been the position that exchanges were not financial services, they are administrative. That had been contested. That was contested at the tax court. In 2010, they confirmed the position of finance, of the revenue agency, and the application of the bank and financial services was that it was not, and of the state was that it's not financial services. Later on, a big gift was given to the banks. They said all of a sudden that it is no longer a financial service, and so that this gift would be paid retroactively to the banks by middle-class Canadians. It's not. I understand that there was a 2-year period where things were a little bit blurry legally. The decision to not go in, to not call it into question is curious. I just wanted to clarify that. Here are my questions. They are for Mr. Gray. After the main estimates, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce said a quote that they were pleased with new measures, and it would allow national companies in green technologies to remain competitive against America and in the fight against lower inflation. Can you explain two things to me? First, why is it so important that the Canadian government invest in these measures in order to remain competitive versus the Americans? And what are the most important measures, in your opinion?
I think it was imperative for the government to match the U.S. fundamentally. We have such an integrated economy with them. It would leave us in a very difficult economic position if we didn't recognize the moves that they made in that sense. So we are grateful to the government to see them make that recognition that not acting to respond to whether it's the IRA or the CHIPS Act would be a fundamental problem for the Canadian economy. We have heard from members, however, that there is a higher degree of difficulty in accessing what the Canadian subsidies would look like relative to the U.S. So I don't mean to raise that as a critique. However, I would think strategically, if you were trying to compete with a neighbor which has much larger purchasing power, the one thing we could do is at least make our program as easy to access. You had a second point. I'm so sorry, I forgot it.
Yeah, les mesures les plus
Inaudible. Some of the measures are in the budget. I won't necessarily name them. According to you, what are the most relevant and the most important ones, and perhaps those that we should focus on the most and maybe improve?
The fundamental one that our members have agreed upon and have praised the government for is the investments in clean electricity. This is going to underpin the transition to EVs. It's going to underpin the electrification of homes, possibly even appliances, running on battery power rather than off, on and off the grid, so as to stabilize demand throughout. It's a competitive advantage upon which Canada can capitalize on. Your province of Quebec already has some of the cheapest electricity out there, and we hear from several of our members, as wide-ranging as the cannabis sector, that having low cost of reliable electricity is a competitive advantage that allows them to ship their goods worldwide cost-effectively.
CMP Châtel, and now we'll hear from the Bloc, MP Samari.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
You have suggested a modification to C-47 that would resolve the issues. I don't think you had all the time to present this modification. In C-47, there seems to be a bit of confusion with regards to the services of companies, what's done in Canada or elsewhere. You have some recommendations. The floor is yours.
Thanks for your question. And I appreciate Mr. Blakey's question as well about identifying the recipient of the supply. The officials, we've listened to the testimony, have consistently said, well, with the blockchain, you can't identify who's transferring, and therefore the GST rules can't apply. For every member of our coalition, I have a contract, and I can identify exactly who they're selling their services to. They're selling their services to non-resident mining pools. Their services are allowing their computing resources to be used by those non-resident mining pools. And as has been emphasized, the reason I know this is bad GST law is because if this industry doesn't get an exemption, businesses in Quebec and Atlantic Canada will incur 15% additional cost in their operations in Quebec and Atlantic Canada, where it's clean hydroelectric power, and they are incentivized to move their businesses, take all the computing services, take the electricity and everything else, and move to Alberta, my home province, where they will only incur 5% non-recoverable GST on those costs, or move outside of Alberta, outside of Canada completely. I know that there's concerns about electricity and the amount of power that the Bitcoin network uses that is used. But the very next thing that takes even more is AI. These organizations have brought high-speed internet to the rural communities which they serve. They are employing individuals with high-paying, sophisticated jobs for maintaining these networks. And my challenge is, and I've asked the officials who have testified in front of you, I've walked them through and said, what am I missing in terms of the explanation? Because it's the non-residents of Canada, those non-resident mining pools that they're selling their services to, they're the ones who are receiving the transfer fees from the transferors on this nebulous thing called the Bitcoin network. But the Canadians are being sideswiped by this legislation. As my friend noted, the legislation was drafted when Mr. Morneau was still the Minister of Finance. And what's been presented and brought forward is now first legislation in February of last year, now revised based in part on our comments. And what the financial officials say is we recognize there needs to be an exemption. What we're asking for is a very simple exemption that provides clarity for the sector. If you're a Canadian, you've got a server farm with a whole bunch of computers, and you're selling your computing resources to a non-resident of Canada, let the normal GST rules apply. You get your input tax credits. You can recover the GST on your expenses like every other exporter in Canada. And that exemption is provided. In that circumstance, there's no incentive for anyone to move from Quebec or anyone to move from Newfoundland or Labrador to Alberta.
Thank you. And merci, MP Samari, MP Blakey.
Thank you very much. So just following up on this, I've been trying to, I guess, just kind of track the interprovincial component, and it seems to me it hinges on the HST. Is that the case? So because the provincial and federal sales tax are tied up in certain provinces, not others.
The competitive imbalance is created because of the different provincial and federal taxes. So HST jurisdictions tends to be closer to 15%. Right. Yeah. In non-HST or jurisdictions with no sales tax, it would be 5%. Right. But to be clear, if this law is passed as is, everywhere where GST is charged, people would be paying the GST. Yeah. What is problematic and what the GST should never do is create an incentive for a business to move from one province to another. Provincial governments are free to incentivize businesses to come to their provinces as much as they would like, but federal GST should be neutral on this. Mm-hmm. This law is not neutral.
Just strictly speaking from the carbon perspective, it might incent companies not just to move to Alberta, but to Manitoba or BC, where there's an abundance of hydroelectricity. I think it's something like 98.5% of electricity in Manitoba is generated with renewable hydroelectric capacity, and we don't participate in the HST in Manitoba. Right. So that would be another potential jurisdiction that folks might be looking to move to.
The challenge with that is there is provincial sales tax with respect to commercial use of electricity. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of the incentives, the reason I've emphasized in Alberta is there's no provincial, all provinces have some form of provincial tax. Some it's through HST, mm-hmm. some is through QST, and some is through a provincial sales tax. Alberta is the example where what you're seeing is the challenge with this piece of legislation. The reason I know it's wrong, when we harmonized in 2010, Ontario joined the HST system and Quebec followed afterwards. The mutual fund industry said, we're going to pick up from Ontario, we're going to move to Alberta. And rules were specifically introduced to ensure, called the Selected Listed Financial Institutions rules, were heavily modified in order to ensure there wasn't a competitive advantage. But I've got a piece of legislation with a highly mobile industry that is, it's computer servers with electricity, selling that computing power through high-speed internet to non-residents of Canada who can easily pick up and move. And the legislation, my biggest challenge in dealing with the finance officials is when I've said, here's the fact pattern, tell me what I'm missing. I can identify who the recipient of the supply is. You keep telling everyone you can't identify them. I can tell you exactly who the counterparty is. Why are you bringing them into this legislation? Mm-hmm. And the answer I received so far was, well, I don't really agree with it, but I can't express why.
Blakey, now to MP Lawrence for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. After hearing the collective testimony, as often happens in these budget consultations, there are very disparate topics here today. And once again, thank you. We've heard everything from beer to banking today. I'm struck, though, with one overwhelming commonality. After 8 years, this government is failing all of your industries. The failures are as varied as your industry, from creating investor uncertainty through the inclusion of retroactive taxation to undermining the hotel industry with failing immigration systems. Even positives in this budget are merely Band-Aid solutions to self-inflicted wounds. The cap on the Excise Tax Act would not be needed if this government had not implemented the escalator tax.
Point of order. Mr. Lawrence raised a point of order at the end of my testimony last time, arguing that this is not the time for us to be answering our own questions, but it's the time to ask questions of the witnesses. And now, that's not something that I did, but that is now something that he is doing.
Yeah, and
so I would,
MP
ask
Baker
him,
and
I would ask you to remind him of why we're here and perhaps ask him to abide by his own point of order.
All right. I know we're a collegial bunch here, so and we're gonna, and I'll keep to that. So you know what? Let's we'll get going, MP Lawrence, and we'll.
I hope my time was preserved through this point of order. Thank you.
And I'm sure you want to get the questions from
I do.
from the witnesses, and we're eager to answer them.
Exactly. So let's pick up where I left off. Even the positives in this budget are merely Band-Aid solutions on self-inflicted wounds. The cap on the Excise Tax Act would not be needed if this government had not implemented an escalator tax. The interswitching provisions would not have been necessary if the government had not canceled the program from 2014. I'm truly sorry for what this government has done to your collective industries and how this Liberal government has let you down. And I'd like to start with one of the most serious issues. In fact, our own Minister of Finance, the Liberal Minister of Finance, said is the Achilles heel of the economy, which is productivity. So with you, Mr. Gray, you talked a little bit about the disincentives to work. You mentioned seniors specifically, but I would broaden that also to parents, and other taxpayers who are subject to clawbacks. Seniors who are low-income seniors, these are individuals earning less than $30,000 a year, with clawbacks are often faced with paying more than 50 cents per dollar if they wish to return to work. Meaning that if I'm a senior contemplating going back to work, helping out perhaps the hotel industry or other industries in their time of labor need, maybe they want to make a little extra money, maybe they want to give their grandkids a present or whatever they want to do with those dollars, they have to hand over to the federal government of Canada 50 cents on every dollar. These are people earning $30,000 a year. This is unconscionable. Mr. Gray, perhaps you could talk about the impact on disincentives to work, such as the GIS clawback and other clawbacks and taxes this government is imposing on seniors and parents.
Discuss the matter. Thank you. Seniors are some of our most knowledgeable and most experienced workers by virtue of their time in the workforce. It seems at a time of a labor shortage that it would be a quick remedy to be able to make some of these changes, such as those you proposed. We've also come out in support of initiatives such as making CPP and EI contributions optional for seniors over, say, 65 or 70. These are not likely people who are going to be, dipping in and out of the workforce, so to speak. These are people who are probably going for one last job for a few years and then trying to enjoy retirement. Equally, we've also called for reform of the mandatory RIF withdrawals at 71 years of age. The RSP system hasn't been reformed since its inception in 1957, when people could be expected to work until 65 and then pretty much die at 75. It's no longer the case. So, forcing seniors to make withdrawals at 71. A lot of Canadian tax planning is essentially a game of trying to minimize your income so that you maximize government benefits, right? It's clearly an impediment to meeting the workforce demands of our country, and we would be happy to collaborate with anyone here on reducing those seniors' disincentives to work.
Thank you. And so you would I think nearly all here would be aware and would agree with me in your varied industries. One of the challenges that the Canadian economy is facing is with respect to productivity. And of course, we are undermining productivity through the disincentives to work, whether it be substantial tax rates, clawbacks. And the other significant issue, and I'll turn to you, Mr. Hanna, on this, is capital investment. We are scheduled to have the worst capital investment in the OECD over the next 20 years. Do you believe that by increasing regulatory uncertainty or taxation uncertainty through retroactive taxation will further underwrite confidence of international investors, perhaps making our already desperate issue with respect to capital investment worse?
Absolutely. Is that short enough?
Off to Ms. Zarowitz Ms. Zarowitz. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I want to say thanks to all the excellent witnesses today and the important testimony that everyone has given today. And I unfortunately only have less than 5 minutes to be able to ask some questions. The first question I have, because I'm always curious about labor and immigration, my first question is to Mr. Gray. You talked about labor needs, and I know that Ms. Greino also did so. We are bringing in a historic amount of immigrants. You have identified and said, you've said to the committee, there's 3 areas we could focus on: express entry, credentialing across the country, and then seniors. So what specifically do we have to do better to make sure that we are matching those that are coming in and immigrating to our country and matching them with the labor needs across our country?
To consider. The first one is streamlining the application procedure and making sure people can get here quickly. Even with the best of intentions to harmonize express entry programs across provinces, we hear our members who say they have a promising candidate, and through delays in the system, they just aren't able to hire the candidate and bring them aboard on time. Whether that's a problem, whether that can be automated in some sense, or whether it can be expanded so that certain credentials are more easily recognized and therefore appropriate candidates are identified earlier in the process. That is, one strong possibility for which we would advocate. The other thing we need to do more broadly is we need to house these people that are coming in. It's all well and good to bring as many foreign talented workers as we can, but they need a place to live. They need a place to grow their families. If I ran a restaurant and I typically staffed 6 people and I were to staff it with 100 people, I wouldn't be that much more productive, frankly. There's just a bottleneck there. And in the Canadian economy, one of the main bottlenecks is the high cost of housing. Again, it is something we hear from our members that they have candidates who would like to come from abroad to work here, but they are just absolutely daunted by the price of a home in Canada.
Okay. And then the next question I have is around normalizing non-status workers. That is in the mandate letter of our Minister of Immigration. Would that, if we actually found a pathway to citizenship for many of our non-status workers that already are here, do you think that would actually be a positive thing to do in terms of addressing some of the labor shortages? And then I'm going to ask Ms. Greino to respond to the same question.
Well, outside of my area of expertise, on the face of it, it would seem sensible. I hope Ms. Greino has a more comprehensive answer that I can offer.
Thank you. I actually also don't know the exact number, but I would advocate that anything helps. But I would love to come back to your first question about what can we do and what's sort of broken. To me, it's very simple. If you look at the permanent economic streams and the ways that people are coming in, so that 500,000, the new high watermark for immigration, it is a point system. So it lets in people who have multiple degrees. The challenge there, and we have credentialing issues in Canada, as you know, is that our sector, the most in-demand positions, are entry-level positions. There is a fundamental misalignment with our immigration program, and with a few small tweaks, and we've already provided these NOT codes to IRCC and to ESDC, we could start to resolve this in a meaningful way.
Thank you. And then my last question is to probably Mr. Gray. We have introduced the National Child Care Program in Canada. We have seen an increase in women working in the workforce. Do you believe that has been positive in terms of productivity in Canada?
The more childcare spaces, the better, though. And while the program has done very well in increasing the demand side of that, there are still supply constraints that I think prevent it from being fully realized. However, in terms of an effect on productivity, yeah, it could be nothing but positive.
Okay. And then my last question just slipped my brain, actually. But I will talk to you. I'm trying to think. How many seconds do I have left, Mr. Chair?
Out of time, so MP Zarowitz.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And members and witnesses. So we do have time for one full last round, and so this will be our third round, and we are starting with MP Morantz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chapman, I always love talking to you. It just seems to me that this government never misses an opportunity to put more taxes on beer. And I know we've been talking about this for a long time. I guess it was nice that they froze it at 2%. But I want to continue on my theme of how this government has become so brazen about breaking its promises that it's actually doing it in the same budget document. So here we have a situation where the government, after being dragged kicking and screaming by our party to freeze the excise tax, decided to deign it so and froze it at 2%. But just this morning, the parliamentary budget officer released a report on the second carbon tax, what they call the clean fuel standard, which says that it's going to add another 17 cents per liter on gasoline. That makes its way through the entire distribution chain, does it not?
It does, yes. I think one thing that differentiates beer from other beverage alcohol categories like wine and spirits is that it is heavy, bulky, and quite expensive to ship across the country. So the price of beer is certainly influenced by the price of fuel.
And Mr. Hanna, I want to go back to part of your submission where you talked about the possibility that the legislative sledgehammer, which is what it is, of applying GST to what should be an exempted service could trigger trade disputes, actually. You say the amendment violates Canada's international trade commitments. Could you elaborate on how that's the case?
Certainly, it brings in new challenges. It brings in new avenues, new concerns. Our bigger concern, candidly, is the implication that that retroactivity just has on Canada as an avenue for a target for investment. It creates a chill. It creates a question about the rule of law and about certainty of law, and it creates uncertainty at the time that Canadians that Canada needs investment, and at a very time when investors are looking for certainty that they don't have.
Yeah. So, but specifically to your submission.
Yep.
You actually say the amendment violates Canada's international trade commitments by treating, this is out of your submission.
Yep.
It says, by treating resident Canadian suppliers and non-resident suppliers differently, opening Canada to trade-related legal challenges. Could you comment on that?
Potentially it could. Potentially it could, absolutely. I can provide some additional details in writing afterwards.
Okay. And Mr. Gray, In your comments, you said, in the time I have left, which probably isn't a lot, Mr. Chair, you said that the government needs to eliminate the disincentives that drive away investment. Could you give us some examples of the kinds of things you'd like them to eliminate?
One of the main avenues we've been focusing on that front is applying a regulatory lens, an economic lens to regulatory affairs. And again, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, this is something that was first proposed in the Advisory Council on Economic Growth's final report in 2017, that regulators take into greater consideration the economic impact of what they're proposing and how they're regulating. Regulatory, the main regulatory issue I think that international investors look at is just the length of time in which it takes to get anything built to approve major projects. And there's a definite economic cost to that. I don't think it's always considered in regulatory processes, and we would advocate for as much streamlining as can reasonably be achieved.
I'm good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah,
and then we're over to MP Sorbara. For 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and great to be here with all my esteemed colleagues, getting along very well today, I see, as always. I'd like to go over to Luke on the beer industry in Canada. Obviously, we worked together on ensuring the escalator increase was limited, and I want to say thank you for working with us and getting to where we needed to get to. Can you give an update on terms of the state of the industry in Canada?
Thanks for your advocacy on this issue, Mr. Sabera, in raising it within the Liberal caucus. It did not go unnoticed, so we appreciate that. Despite some of the media commentary over the past couple of years, the Canadian brewing industry is not growing. It's not flat. It is in decline on a volume basis. As I noted in my opening remarks, from 2019 to 2022, volume beer sales declined by about 6%. And at the same time, we saw that the cost of producing beer in Canada rise significantly. Key inputs like barley, packaging materials like cans and bottles up by as much as 60%. And also, brewers are supportive, but are also spending a huge amount of money to eliminate the use of plastic ring carriers by the effective date of June 2024. So it's been a challenging period.
No, and thank you, Luke. And I want to give a shout out to all the workers that work at the brewers, whether it's Molson's or Labatt, whether it's in London or Etobicoke, all those union members that work there and have good middle class jobs and good benefits and so forth, and the workers in the restaurants and the whole continuum. Quickly to Alex, and then I want to go to Susie. Alex, Chamber of Commerce, in terms of our investments in budget 2023, the income tax credits that we put in place, whether it's on the forming up a solid electrical grid system in Canada, which we know will need to expand the baseload significantly, to the manufacturing tax credits. Those are measures that will increase the productive capacity of our economy.
I wouldn't disagree.
Thank you. Over to Susie. One thing I've heard with regards to the hotel industry is actually the number of hotels in Canada, the numbers of rooms in Canada, and particularly in the Greater Toronto area. There's a sort of a trend that some of these hotels are being converted into condos, that there are actually not enough hotel rooms for our tourism sector. Can you kindly comment on that in the state of the industry and any issues thereof?
Yes, we did slow development, certainly over the COVID period. It has been slow to come back, and that is predominantly being driven by high input costs. The cost of development charges can be up to 40% of a total project. Now, those are municipal issues. The cost of building is significant, and so we are seeing more multi-use facilities, and we do have a hotel capacity problem all across the country as we speak.
Thank you. And I know MP Zervitz addresses the issue of labor, and she's done a lot of great work on that. And there are a number of us that are concerned that we not only encourage people who have multiple degrees, but encourage people who just want to come to Canada and work hard and build a better future, much like my parents came some 50 plus years ago and did that with very limited education, but things turned out pretty good with hard work and hope, right? To the Bankers Association, the issues of integration, the issues of retroactive taxation are issues I'm very well versed with and very well aware. Canadian banks are a linchpin of our economy. They underpin our economy, something we need to be proud of. What measures you're here? You stated your case. There's been a healthy interaction amongst both sides on that case. What is the numerical amount of the retroactive tax that would impact the industry?
I believe, according to finance officials, the retroactive amount is $195 million, which represents about 5/100 of tax revenue.
Okay. So, and whether, there's going to be an argument on whether it should be retroactive or not, and we'll have views, and whether the tax, in fact, should be put in place. Is there an issue whether, in fact, these services should be taxable?
Yes. To the discussion earlier, it's a unusual thing to do, to be increasing taxation on a service that at the same time where you are trying to lower the cost of card acceptance.
And your argument was that the incidence of any increase in taxation would fall on who?
The incidence of any taxation will ultimately fall on the users of the card system, which are both the consumers, because they are customers of the issuers, and the merchants, because they are customers of the acquirers.
Thank you, Chair.
Barra. And now to MP Sainte-Marie, please.
Oui, Monsieur le Président, je vais commencer par un rappel au...
I'm going to start with a point of order. Yes, a point of order. When MPs or witnesses start giving their answer, if the microphone is not turned on, then the interpretation services cannot come through. So just a little reminder. I would like to welcome and thank all of our witnesses once again. It's a very interesting panel, and sadly our time is limited, and just because we did not have a chance to ask all of our questions, it doesn't mean that we have not listened to what you have had to say and that we will not take into consideration your recommendations. So this is my last turn, Mr. Robertson and Mr. Brock. Mr. Robertson, you said that mining activities require a lot of computing capacity, but also AI. In Quebec and Canada, we are developing some expertise that have these computational capacities. If C-47 is adopted as is, it will harm the development and the future of this sector, which is important. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll make a quick comment on that, and maybe you can walk through the legislative proposals. So what this sector is doing right now is building the infrastructure for high-performance computing. Right today, the economics of supplying that computing power to companies that use it to mine Bitcoin are very attractive, which is why that computing power is going there. That's where the highest return for the investment in that computing power is coming from the sector. But we don't know what the future is going to hold in terms of the development more broadly of high-performance computing. We have an expectation that there will be other areas of the economy, other areas of innovation that are going to be created, which will be able to draw on that capacity. And what this sector is doing is laying the groundwork for that. It's attracting significant investment. It's enabling us to train young people in this new area of innovation and commerce. And so, yes, what's happening here is relatively in a small scale, but it's the beginning of something that's going to be quite significant. And Canada is uniquely positioned to play a leadership role in supplying clean computing power to the world.
That's the exciting part, is the side benefits. The number of companies that are selling the heat from their computers to their local community centers that are coming off of the grid and not using natural gas, using immersion technologies to cool these machines and transfer that heat so we're not contributing to global warming, high-speed internet to rural communities. This is my challenge with All we're asking for is nothing, we're not asking for it to be this huge exemption. What we're asking is that the Canadians who have the computers be specifically excluded if they're selling their services to a non-resident mining pool. As I said at the beginning, the problem with the legislation is it's basically saying your customer's using it for crypto asset mining, so we're going to treat you that way. All we've done, we put it together, is asked for a very simple amendment to be added to the legislation.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, MP Saint-Marie. MP Blakey.
Very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gray, I expect we may not agree on all the finer points of employment insurance policy, but one thing that I know both the Canadian Labour Congress and the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses has talked about is the decision of the government to attribute $25 billion worth of CERB debt to the EI account. And, the EI account has a legislated mandate to balance over a 7-year horizon. This is essentially going to push up premiums without any added value to the employment insurance program. I'm wondering if the Canadian Chamber of Commerce also has concern about this decision to allocate that debt to the EI account as opposed to keeping it on the general ledger.
I think it's a pretty reasonable concern to have. Labor is, are they talking? No, just cross-talking, sorry. It's not something that's come across my desk. However, that seems at first glance to me to not make a whole heck of a lot of sense, to be honest. And it's actually something I'd be happy to discuss further.
Right on. Mr. Chapman, I just was curious to know, we're obviously making an exception to the excise tax rules as written. As somebody who thinks it's important for Parliament to approve financial matters, it's never sat comfortably with me, the principle of having an automatic escalator tied to inflation for things like the excise tax. I just wonder, if you think there's some lessons learned there about choosing to proceed with excise tax increases in this way more generally.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think this tax mechanism has been in place since 2017, and I think 2023 is the perfect example of why we've opposed this since 2017. These annual increases are determined using an inflation indexing formula, and as inflation rises, the size of each annual increase goes up. So as I noted in my opening remarks, this year's increase was triple the previous 5-year average. Those past 5 years, none of the increases went before Parliament for a vote. Looking forward to next year, it's going to be another outsized increase of between 4% and 5%, just because of the nature of inflation. So this is going to be an ongoing headache until inflation gets below or around 2%. So, from our perspective, our industry we would love to see these annual increases or increases at all go before Parliament for debate. And I'll just end by saying thank you, Mr. Blakey and the NDP, for your support in raising this issue leading up to the federal budget. We appreciate you meeting with our union reps, and they see this as a big threat to their jobs as well. During a period of declining beer sales, taking more money away from the businesses reduces their ability to negotiate with their bosses. So we do appreciate the NDP's support in raising the issue as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Blakey. And now to the Conservatives, MP Lawrence for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I'll just start with the canola growers, if I can. Either Mr. Carey or Mr. White, feel free to respond. Of course, the interswitching program was changed in 2017 to a program that, due to red tape and bureaucracy, my understanding, was no longer usable. This budget, it's going to put employers a pilot program for interswitching again. Some of the critics have raised some objections to that, and I'd just like you to have the opportunity to spill some of those myths, such as there might be a slow in rail traffic or a loss of employment for the railways. Could you please tell me why I'm wrong?
No, thank you for the question. I'm getting an echo here. Oh, there, it's fixed. Thank you for the opportunity to respond to that. We've heard the myths, I guess, being portrayed by the railways that this type of pilot project would be bad for the economy. It would be bad for the supply chain resilience. It'd be bad for labor. We've heard all.
So we're having some technical challenges there, so we'll wait till we get Mr. White back. MP Lawrence, if you want to continue.
I think I saw Mr. Carey.
I can continue.
Okay, Mr. Carey.
We've got the in-person version too. So.
Sure. Yeah, there's been a lot of rhetoric certainly about this. Interswitching is something that's been used in Canada since the 1900s, and railways are consistently switching whether locomotives or train cars. Actually, every shipment that goes to the Port of Vancouver, whether it's CP or CN, ultimately gets put on a CN locomotive to go over the bridge. 160 kilometers is a good start. However, it will only handle about 90% of grain handling facilities, and it misses massive growing regions of our country, such as northern Alberta and northern Saskatchewan. Interswitching is the only tool we have with the duopoly of Class 1 railways to incentivize any competition. And the key part of interswitching is not its use, it's the threat of its use allows shippers to negotiate with their originating carrier to try to get a better rate, better service. And the other one around labor is that there is an agreement among the International Brotherhood of Teamsters that says that U.S. crews cannot come up in Canada, and Canadian crews cannot go into the United States. So every railway that's running in Canada is run by a Canadian union crew. So there's a lot of myths out there. I'd say a lot of it's been dramatized for dramatic purposes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to switch from there to Ms. Grinnell. You, of course, your members have been through a very difficult time, whether it be COVID or now the labor shortage. My questions are going to be specifically to you with respect to the carbon tax. Of course, we had the original carbon tax, which I would assume would hurt people, the travel industry, as it makes travel more expensive, and that's set to triple over the coming years. In addition, we just heard from my colleague, of course, talking about the parliamentary budget officer, that there's a brand new carbon tax that's set to add another 17 cents. To a liter of gasoline, and I'm wondering whether whether you believe that is helpful or hurtful to your industry.
Well, anytime there's cost introduced into the system, it makes it more expensive to travel. That's obviously not a good thing. But I will say that when we look at the global traveler across the country, across the world. Almost every data point suggests that they are planning to travel in the immediate future, notwithstanding rising costs. And if you look back to the recession in 2008, in fact, travel was one of the few sort of counterweights to other sectors that would typically see regression over that time period. So we are fairly confident that travel is a really good investment. At this point, I think our focus is more on how do we maximize that investment, because it seems at this point in time that people are planning to travel regardless of those rising costs. It's one of the few things they are not prepared to part from, maybe because it was taken away for 2 years. And so it's here to stay. And our biggest fear, of course, is that Canada just doesn't capitalize on our market potential because we have labor policies that don't allow us to have hotel rooms open and have a functional tourism industry.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Gray, I'll just go back to you quickly. I've just got a little bit of time here. So one of the other items that you pointed out on the laundry list of challenges that your members are facing was our cumbersome Income Tax Act there. Maybe I'll just give you the floor for whatever I've got left. So talk about the 10,000 pages of the Income Tax Act in 3 seconds.
There you there.
Governments have promised tax reform since 1967, and that was the last time it ever happened. So let's get to it.
Okay, thank you. And now, thank you, MP Lawrence. Now over to MP Baker, please. And MP Baker will be our final questioner today.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks to all the witnesses again for being here today. I'd like to come back to Ms. Greinel. We had the chance to ask you a few questions the last time you were here at committee, and a number of months ago. During your testimony, you made several recommendations. One of them you talked about was around the labor shortage, in terms of how programs. I think you talked about a program that was successful in employing some of the refugees who come to Canada from Syria, how it could help the Ukrainians. Could you just expand on that?
Yes. I would be delighted to expand on that. So a few years ago, we worked with the government, the Minister of Immigration at the time, to create what's called a bridge program. And effectively what this does is it supports new Canadians who arrive and can have a somewhat random experience in terms of where they end up working, whether they end up working, and how quickly that process happens. And so this program was hugely successful by the government's own report. And what it does is it supports people who come in, brings the employer to the table with various job opportunities. It enhances training, and it had an incredible success rate. And so it's there. The infrastructure is there. It does not cost. There was not a significant cost to it. And our immediate recommendation is that the government reinvest in that program. It's called Destination Canada, and it would allow us to mobilize and be purposeful about where some of these new Canadians are ending up working, especially as we are staring down the barrel of a high demand season and an opportunity that we don't want to leave on the table.
Okay. And just like, how would that work? Like, for the folks at home who are watching, how would that program work in today's context?
So we work with a partner, Tourism HR Canada, and so we already have all the infrastructure set up where we've got relationships with all the settlement agencies, and so there's an intake process. So when new Canadians arrive, we would do an assessment of their skills, and we would be able to easily place them into a variety of workers. And to be clear, these are not just entry-level positions. We have had a mass exodus, in case anyone hasn't noticed. So we've got a range of positions available. And so it's about matching skill with available positions, bringing employers to the table, and almost sort of white glove servicing them through that process to ensure that they end up where they need to. They've got a job that makes sense. They've got training. And there's also training available for their families. And so it's really a sort of extra care package to make sure that the people coming to Canada, and many of the Ukrainians that are here, are actually unemployed at the moment, and could really benefit from some increased enhancements at the settlement agency level.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. I mean, I think all of us in this room, all the members in this room, meet with and are trying to help new Canadians settle in Canada all the time. And for my part, a large percentage of those folks happen to be Ukrainians who are fleeing the war. And so I think, so when I heard you mention that there's an opportunity potentially here, I got a little bit excited. So I'm glad you expanded upon that. That's something for us to definitely consider. But it's really, really important that no matter where folks are coming from around the world, there happen to be a lot of Ukrainians coming to Canada now because of the war. But no matter
it doesn't
where they're
discriminate.
That's right.
It can be anybody who comes,
That's
regardless of their skill level.
That's right. That's right. That they're able to find employment, and you're basically putting your hand up and saying, we need people.
We'll take them.
And
we'll support them.
And a lot of the folks who are coming are qualified to work in your
anyone
sector. Yeah.
Even if they have no command of the English language, we can employ them.
Okay, great. I believe I have about a minute left. Is that right, Chair? Okay. So I guess again, Ms. Grant, I'll come back to you. Could you just talk about the how important is the funding of $108 million in the last budget to the regional development agencies for local tourism?
So we're pleased. We're very pleased to see that funding in there. It's $158 million in total, so $108 to the regional development agencies, which will support local regional tourism development, and $50 million to support business events. As you may know, business events, we were sort of closed for a period of time there in Canada, and so the lag time to book those big events has meant that we've got some catch-up work to do. And so that money is incremental. It's going to support Destination Canada to be able to attract back those big business events, and we're thrilled. What we did not see in the budget, of course, were any of our major labor recommendations, which is why we're here today to talk about some refinements there, which, again, are no cost to government. They're quite easy to make and would allow us to capitalize on all of the investment opportunities that we can see here in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I know on the labor piece, that's not necessarily requiring a significant cash outlay, but with the $108 million, with some of the other asks that have been made of us today, I think it's a good reminder of how challenging being Minister of Finance can be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Is that there's so many asks before us, many with great merit, and when we grant resources in one direction, those are resources we can't grant elsewhere. So anyway, thank you for your time.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. MP Baker. We've had a full house here. Great questions from the members and great answers, great testimony from the witnesses. I'm sure at this time we've heard about food and hospitality and beer and alcoholic and non-alcoholic, and it sounds and the weather's pretty good outside. So we thank our witnesses for coming before us again in such short order and be able to provide the testimony that you have for our study. We thank you, members. We're going to be adjourned at this time. We'll be back this afternoon after question period. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.